The modern metagame is hot garbage. Let's be complete honest with ourselves. There's no saving it. You have the casuals saying that it's fine. They see so much variety, but then you have the grinders that know the truth, that play the vast majority of the games out there and see scam just being 20% of the metagame. It is absolutely insane how far this deck has been allowed to go. But I think there is a small solution, a light at the end of the tunnel, too, particularly that I want to talk about in this video, that could provide a solution. One, namely a card, and next, namely an event. So the card itself is one that I want to lead up to talk about why this card could actually be a really solid sideboard card in the upcoming couple of weeks leading into the banned and restricted announcement. Bit of a hint there. And why this may change some of the ways that you think about what's actually going on in the modern metagame. Firstly, we have Tom White talking about how I don't think he's ever seen that 11 of the top 32 decks in the modern challenge be the same deck. Now, Dom Harvey talks about below about like Uro just being absolutely everywhere. That was a crazy deck. But Rakdos mid-range being 34% of this last Friday's modern challenge and just being 20% of the metagame in general here, according to Goldfish, which is absolutely insane, is something to understand. You essentially have to beat scam or play scam, and there is a small niche where you beat the decks trying to beat scam, and there are different ways that those decks are trying to do that. I mean, look, it's not just Goldfish telling you that that's what the metagame is doing. Look at MTG top 8. Last 2 weeks, Rakdos aggro 20% of the metagame. In the last 2 months, it's 15%. The deck shows itself. The deck does a lot, and you have to beat it or beat the decks trying to beat it. And so that is where this video comes from. I wanted to show everyone watching this what the rest of the metagame is doing and how we can actually pick it apart. There's actually one card that actually does this really well, and it actually addresses every single deck in the metagame in some way, shape, or form. Honestly, there's every deck in the metagame is playing an artifact or an enchantment. Might be a hint as to where I'm going. Now, the solution to this really comes down to analyzing what's going on. How do you beat Rakdos scam? Do you go under it and you play burn? Do you just aggro it out? Now, the aggro decks, they aren't playing Eidolon of the Great Revel anymore. In a format full of leyline binding, it's hard to punish decks for not playing anything under 3 CMC. The scam itself is rarely playing things under 3 CMC, and if they are, I mean, those spells are just beating you anyway. So they're playing something like Roiling Vortex, which is still an enchantment. And so something like this is important because they want to play the long game, preventing you from gaining any life. And then heck, if you're casting free stuff, this card actually slaps so hard. So Roiling Vortex is actually really good. And then you can also just go over it. You can play the decks that don't really care about getting thought seized or just can play around it or play against it really well. I'm thinking of something like Modern Tron, where you play the Urza's Tower, you play out your lands, and these are relatively thought seize proof. And then you just top deck really well. You play Karn the Great Creator, and that's something that scam cannot really take from your hand. And obviously, if you're playing something like, the red scam piece in general, Fury, the card that I think should be banned, if you play that, then the Karn Great Creator can just find solutions for that anyway. You're not really playing Karn Liberated anymore in these decks. You're playing other options such as the One Ring, which can fog it for a turn, and sometimes that's all you need to draw into the answer for that card. So regardless, you go under or you go over. And if those are what the decks are doing, they have specific plans. They're playing artifacts, they're playing enchantments. Is there a card that can answer artifacts and enchantments relatively easily? Well, it's a null. If you look at a card like an Annul, a counterspell that is relatively innocuous and honestly a popper staple for a very long time, counter target artifact or enchantment, and it's not non-creature artifact or anything restrictive like that. If it's an artifact or enchantment, it can get countered. And that's what's beautiful about it. If you're playing blue, you have access to something like this. And honestly, if you're playing modern these days, you probably do it. The mana bases are so dead easy these days, and you have to be playing multiple colors anyway. Annul does so much, and maybe not main board. Out of your sideboard, this card actually slaps. Just take a look at this. Obviously, okay, the One Ring, easy. Counter that, prevent the protection. You get around the indestructible when it resolves. Like it just goes before it enters the battlefield. And then you have Up the Beanstalk, the latest addition to the modern metagame, giving the 5-color deck some crazy legs. I mean, take a look at Domain Zoo getting a second resurgence just off of this. It's crazy how good this card is. And then you have Fable the Mirror Breaker. You may not exactly bring it in against Scam, but the enchantment exists in that deck. Colossus Hammer, plenty of artifacts in that deck. Leyline Binding in those matchups. So Leyline Binding being the domain removal spell of choice these days. If that's going to be the only removal spell, if you can just counter this pretty well, you can handle the rest of the meta, the game itself in blue. You just play your removal spells, play your counter spells for the burn spells, and Annul handles the one removal they have for your threat pieces pretty easily. And heck, you throw an Amulet of Vigor in there. There's plenty of other things to counter in the Titan decks themselves. They're playing One Rings and, you know, Karn Wishboard sometimes, so it's all there to counter. So Annul is actually a really powerful card in the current modern metagame. But I think what I'm trying to highlight here is not only is that Annul is really good, but Modern is becoming an arms race. It really feels like if you're trying to get under or over Scam and you're just trying to race to beat that deck, and all decks are focusing on doing that, they would kind of just be ignoring each other. They're playing these cards that give them points in these matchups and give them a lot of advantage against the Thoughtseize effects, against that statement of I'm going to present to you with a 4/3 or a 3/3 with double strike, and if you cannot answer this, then you lose the game. If the game becomes about resolving certain pieces and winning that way, then arguably it's not just about Annul. The arms race gets a little bit deeper. And that comes from a card like Veil of Summer, which I think actually is really underrated right now. And there's only one deck in the modern metagame that plays it right now, and it's honestly the 5-color Domain Zoo deck, the deck that's seen the resurgence with Beanstalk and is pretty well answered with Annul if you know, against a well-timed Leyline Binding. Veil of Summer is actually really good, because a card like this allows your spells to resolve against the blue heavy decks. If Dimir Control and Murktide are still going to run the roost, then Veil of Summer is actually really powerful. It also blanks the Scam decks. If your opponent casts a black spell against you, well, then you're going to gain hexproof, you're going to replace this card, and they're not going to be able to really get any value from that Scam effect. They can reanimate it, but whatever, you're not losing your best cards. You still have the information withheld from your opponent, and you're still able to prevent any advantage they get from removing those. You keep your removal spells, you get to redraw. It's pretty darn good. And then honestly, if they scam out the Fury, then hopefully you have the removal spell. If you're playing something like Veil of Summer in 4-color Domain Zoo, 5-color as well, you got Bolts, you got Tribal Flames, you have the removal for a 3/3. So Veil of Summer is actually low-key underrated, and I think more people should be playing this along with Annul in their sideboards. If you're able to, if you're playing blue, play Annul. If you're playing Veil, the card actually is surprisingly good in paper, but maybe there's more layers to it. Especially when you think of tempo decks, Death Shadow being the classical example of tempo that I think of, where you play a cheap threat and you defend it. And so that's where a card like Veil of Summer and Annul comes into effect, where you can't be affected by black removal spells or just black removal spells, or your spells can't be countered in general, so you get to resolve your threats, you get to resolve your removal, and they can't really use that removal against you. But Death Shadow is a deck that really gets clobbered by Solitude. So I'm thinking of something like Leyline Binding, the 4 or 5-color decks that are mid-range, control, tempo. There's a little bit of everything going on in those decks. They're probably more so aggro mid-range, honestly, but those are decks that rely on resolving one key card, and it's gonna be the Leyline Binding, it's gonna be the Tribal Flames, it's gonna be the threat or the answer. And if something like that is important in the current modern metagame, if tempo is key, then Veil of Summer rules the roost. And I think, again, for the third time, more people should be playing that card. It's not just Annul. If you need to counter your opponent from interacting with you, then Annul is great. But if you need to resolve your own threats, Veil of Summer slaps the bejesus out of this metagame. And I think it's worth playing. But after all this discussion, where are we at now? Well, honestly, I don't have a solution for you. I think these are just good cards to play, and they're good cards to look out for. People are looking for solutions and new things to try. And the thing to look out for is, thanks to Robert Taylor talking about how the banned restricted announcement, next one is October 16th. We're, less than 10 days away from that at this point. And so what happens then? Does Modern finally get addressed? Do we finally ban the 3 cards that I think need to go in this Modern metagame? I'll let you guess what those 3 cards are, because I think if you've watched this channel for a little bit, you can guess 2 of them. They're red cards. The third one, I'm gonna hide as to what that card is. It could be a red card, it could not be. But there are 3 cards that I think I largely agree can be banned from Modern to produce a positive outcome, a positive shift in what is going on right now, and provide a change. We're not gonna get scammed a bunch anymore, hopefully at least. And I think it's going to be a good thing moving forward. Let's look out for the banned and restricted announcement. In the meantime, let's play some Veils and a Null. And for now, let me know what you think in the comment section down below. What do you think of the 2 cards that I talked about here? What do you think about the banned and restricted announcement coming up soon? Do you think there's going to be no changes in Modern? If there's no changes, are you going to be playing Modern in general? Are you playing in Modern in general right now? Let me know all in the comment section down below.